scientific article is Prospect Theory, an analysis of decision under risk by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. The goal of this paper was to show how an economic model called the expected utility theory was insufficient in explaining how people made decisions. Another model, the prospect theory, was proposed in its place. According to the expected utility theory, when you make a choice between two options, three things happen. First, the satisfaction derived from an option can be represented by all the possible ways the outcomes of that option can be used and enjoyed. If you had to choose between buying a car and buying a house, the satisfaction you will get from buying the car will be represented by everything you could possibly use the car for. You could drive it, you could leave it parked at home, you could take pictures, you could wreck it if that brings you pleasure. Second, an option is valuable as long as its outcome adds to your total worth. If a man has 3 cars and the opportunity to get another car arises, he will readily do so because having 4 cars is greater than having 3 cars. 3. People hate any kind of risk. They will always select an option with a certain outcome over one with an uncertain one. Every reasonable person will choose to sit on a steady chair rather than an unsteady one. Kahneman and Tversky made observations about people's choice behaviors and found them inconsistent with the assumptions of the expected utility theory. For instance, they observed that people placed less value on outcomes that are merely possible than those that were sure. People don't experience road accidents every day. Therefore, they place a low value on that as a possible outcome of overspeeding. On the other hand, if you choose not to pay your credit card debt, the outcome is a finance charge from the credit card company. This outcome is sure, and you will value it more. Kahneman and Tversky call this the certainty effect. The certainty effect made people avoid risk when it was sure they could gain, and embrace risk when it was certain they would lose. For instance, if you choose to quit your job to become an entrepreneur, making $1 billion in a year is a possible outcome. However, because there is uncertainty associated with that outcome, many people will be risk averse and stay in their jobs. On the other hand, if you are suddenly diagnosed with cancer, you will be ready to use different drugs and other alternative remedies. In other words, you will be risk averse. Another observation that exposed the inconsistencies in the expected utility theory was what Kahneman and Tversky called the isolation effect. They observed that when people had the opportunity to choose between 2 options, they became blind to the features that the outcomes had in common. For instance, when you go to the supermarket for cereal or toothpaste, the similarities between the brands dissolve and their differences stand out. The isolation effect made people more likely to make different decisions when the same options were presented to them in slightly different forms. For instance, people seemed to see a package containing 75% sugar differently from one that is 25% sugar-free. If people only selected options that benefited them, such descriptions should not influence decision-making. Kahneman and Tversky proposed an alternative theory that better describes what happens when humans choose between options. They call this the prospect theory. The prospect theory posits 3 characteristics of human choice. 1. Unlike the expected utility theory that says an option is valuable as long as it adds to your worth, the prospect theory says the value of an option is dependent on how much its outcome changes your total worth. For instance, the satisfaction an additional car will bring to a man with 3 cars will be much smaller than the satisfaction it will bring to a man with no car. The same unit of car has a different effect depending on each man's initial state. 2. Gains feel good to a certain point, after which additional gains do not cause an equivalent additional satisfaction. Similarly, additional losses cause more than an equal amount of pain. A man who has no cars will feel very satisfied with his first car, but by the time he is at the third car, the level of additional satisfaction from one car will be less. In the same vein, a man who loses his only car will feel more pain than a man who has 3 cars and lost one. According to the expected utility theory, since both men lost one car, they should feel the same level of pain. 3. When choosing between options, people do not think in terms of the likelihood of the outcomes, but rather in terms of the impact of the outcome. If a person about to flip a coin asks you to pick a side, you will probably pick heads or tail at random because you know each option has a 50% chance of happening. What if, before flipping the coin, the person told you that it will give you $1,000 if the outcome was heads? Most people will weigh tails lower than heads even though the probability of either option is still 50%. Because people do not think in terms of probabilities, they either ignore or overweight an outcome that is low in probability. For instance, the likelihood of a plane crash is very low, so people ignore it and continue to fly. On the other hand, the likelihood of winning the lottery is very low, yet people overweigh it and continue to gamble. Similarly, when an outcome is very likely to happen, people treat it as certain. People continue to show up to work with the expectation of a pay at the end of the week or at the end of the month. Yet no one can be certain that the corporation will continue to exist in a year's time.